Hi, Misha here, and this will probably be a pretty quick one. And we've actually looked at one of these before, but people like Chinese Kalashnikov-based guns. So let's talk about another NHM-91, a Norinco imported by CSI, Chamber 4762x39. This is kind of considered their RPK, or at least a postman semi-automatic version thereof. So with that, let's jump and talk about the history of the original military select fire version made in China.
They got nothing.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that exhaustive, in-depth history. Yeah, this really isn't based on something that China issued, at least to its own military. It actually didn't make the RPK. It produced the RPD until finally modernizing with the Type 81 series, and then it did make an LMG version of the Type 81, which externally does resemble the RPK, but internally is quite different. With that, let's compare. For that, I'll bring out my best example of a 1960s Soviet RPK. This is my Legion build. It's an original kit on a US receiver with US barrel, just to show the differences. Starting at the butt end, the RPK does have the clubfoot stock borrowed from the RPD, different stock but same pattern, and that would be carried over to our NHM here. Well, we'll talk about exactly, but this is the correct stock for it. It's worth pointing out that the Chinese stock lacks the sling swivel and is also about 2 inches longer. Both of these do have wood pistol grips, although Russia would quickly go over to Bakelite synthetic. Both also have a 1.5mm receiver, but a totally different pattern. Not to get too in the weeds, because we've talked about Chinese guns a lot, but the Chinese 1.5mm receiver was reverse engineered. China never had the, we'll call it data package for the AKM or the RPK. It actually reverse engineered using some AKMs and RPKs obtained from third parties like Albania. So their receiver is different rivet placement, no bulge, what have you. Smooth top cover. Now this is an early build, so it has the AKM rib top cover, but typically your Russian guns would have smooth as well, the heavier. Russian has the windage and elevation adjustable rear sight. The Chinese, just the elevation. And then you get to the handguards. The Russian are a little thicker, a little boxier for the heavier barrel. And the Chinese, at least on the NHM91, are this kind of non-ventilated slab side. Up front, we have a ported gas tube here and not here. Both have a 45-degree, roughly speaking, gas block. But the differences are quite clear. The Russian has over a 23-inch barrel that's quite heavy. It gets fatter as you go back. And the Chinese, while it is a heavy-ish barrel, it's mostly heavy because of its kind of inspiration of the original gun, so it's not as heavy. And also this barrel is right at 20 inches instead of 23. So overall length is about the same because our stock is a little longer, but our barrel is a little shorter. Flipping these over, this has the non-lightning cut carrier, but later RPKs would have it. And an RPK typically had a paint over phosphate finish, whereas like most Chinese guns, this has a blued finish. The carriers on these could either be polished white are kind of a plum color, depending on the factory. Dimpled magwell here. And early RPKs like this one also had a dimpled magwell, but soon they would do away with that and go to internal reinforcing plates. Both would have pressed and pinned in barrels. And as I'm sure you noticed, both have very different bipods. Same concept, but the Chinese is tubular and adjustable, and it doesn't really clamp. It kind of just floats around, whereas the Russian is kind of a square shape and stamped steel and clamps to itself and the cleaning rod. But hey, at least they are both threaded 14x1 left hand, right? So the only thing that really makes this Chinese gun like the RPK is the general shape of the buttstock, because they both kind of inherited it from the RPD, and the fact that they have longer barrels with bipods. But even there, the length is different, the bipod is different. Otherwise, the only way they're really in common is the fact that they're both Kalashnikov-inspired guns. So, what is our Chinese so-called LMG here, really? Well, if we're being honest, it's simply a Type 56 with a longer barrel. And to help illustrate that, I brought out what is still considered new to me, that Clayco, which is a standard semi-automatic 56S type gun. 16-inch and a quarter barrel. This has the AKM or Type 2 style bayonet lug, threaded. But because the Chinese Type 56 was essentially an AK Type 3 but on a stamped receiver, we have so many leftover Type 3 features. The heavy receiver is kind of a direct holdover of that, so the parts are still compatible with the mill. We have the smooth top cover. We have the ported gas tube, the somewhat heavier barrel. Many still have the Type 1 lug, although it does have the unique Chinese enclosed front sight. It still has the 800-meter rear here, though. That's what it is. It's just a Type 56 with a roughly 4-inch longer barrel. Well, that and a different buttstock, but they are interchangeable. Both have the top tang only design. You could put one on the other. So the differences are just the front end. And the reason there's really no history is because this wasn't really something they ever did for the Chinese military. But it was popular in the late 80s and 90s to send over long-barreled AKMs to America. China would do several, and there would even be those Egyptian guns. And that's what we have here. Like I said, I just thought I'd bring that out. You can check out previous videos for more on the Chinese evolution. But, well, it's not an RPK. Not even close, really. And it's not really a semi-automatic version of a military gun at all, but that still doesn't mean it can't be cool and fun to shoot. So, with that, let's just kind of focus on the NHM91 itself. In the pre-ban era, i.e. before March of 1989, there were some longer barrel versions of the AK imported from China. For example, and probably the most famous, the National Match, which was on a milled receiver, part of the Polytech line. There were some stamped-based Norinco guns as well. Some call them an 86S, but that's actually the bullpup. I've also seen 87S used, but then, I don't know, it's a little murky, frankly. What I can tell you is there are at least 3 different bipod variants featured on them. But of course, in 1989, there would be the executive order banning the importation of assault rifles, but that would not deter China, Norinco, or any of their importers, so CSI quickly picked up the line. Now, there is the NHM-90. That's essentially a MAK90, just with a different name. There's also a MAK91, which is a long-barreled MAK90 with a milled receiver. But before you get too excited, the MAK91s, as far as I know, all have a slant cut in the back. Now, I've read online that some people think this is a way to keep from regular stock and grip to be installed. That's not really true. That's because those receivers were originally destined to be underfolders, but then the band came through, so they were reworked not to waste them. It's just unfortunate they also do make it harder to put stocks and stuff on. So it wasn't anything specified by the government. It just kind of happened that way. But back to the NHM91, yeah, that is a long-barreled version, like we have here, on a stamped receiver. And at least theoretically, these could be slant back or square, although for whatever reason, all I've ever had are square, so maybe they all are, I don't know. They came with a thumbhole stock, I believe it was Boyd's. This one came to me with a Chinese clubfoot and wood grip. And they could ship with either a short mag like this one here, or a 30, and 40 round Chinese were also available, because why wouldn't they be? And of course drums as well. Sporter type handguard, although you could install more military looking ones. And these weren't as heavily neutered as a lot of MAK90s, for example. They still had threaded barrels, although a nut was typically tack welded on. Sometimes the muzzle brake was tack welded on in its place. There was kind of a specific brake / flash hider that China used. It's also worth pointing out this has the open-topped front sight base, not the 56 style closed. And this has the bipod that clamps on with screws behind. Some of the earlier ones actually go in front of. And this one does have a cleaning rod under the barrel, so there's still a hole here. Some do, some don't. Doesn't really matter. It's even reported that some have a rivet to try to prevent evil mags from being inserted, but again, I've never had them come in that way. Internally, it's, yeah, like any other Chinese AK. And here it is with the bipod deployed, kind of in the bench configuration, and these were at least loosely marketed as target guns, or at least bench guns. Yeah, you can notice the cleaning rod actually flares down. The other one I did a video on years ago did that too. So it'll hold one, but it's not really made to mount one. There's not the bracket under here. There's not the loop under the block. The only thing really holding it in is the handguard and then our bipod itself. Note the clampy clamp screws for the bipod. That's because part of the 89 ban didn't like bipods on guns, but once they were imported, they could be installed. Same goes with the threads here. You can see where this one had its weld broken, not by me, but now the nut freely unscrews. If it were a MAK90, it would have also had its bayonet lug ground off. And our 40 round mag. And it's actually kind of nice with this bipod and a 40 round mag because you can do this. With the standard RPK bipod, when you put in the 40 round mag, it tends to monopod. But with the adjustable all the way out, and it does have positions, it will sit just fine. Obviously a drum would fit fine too. The adjustable Romanian also allows for this. It's kind of a neat little feature. I do like this bipod. It adjusts very easily, although I could understand if this wasn't exactly a military tough bipod. But for a civilian, yeah, sure. Works fine. Some have reported these have better than average triggers. That's not been my experience, but they're not bad. They're Chinese double hook machine triggers. That combined with the nice blued finish, yeah, it means that they'll probably work out pretty well. And these were made in a couple of different factories. But they only sold modestly well, because to a lot of people, this is just a longer, heavier AK. And most people in the 90s, and even today, bought these as kind of truck guns, blasters, just for having fun. But I've always been partial to light machine gun types.
Standard AK. Safety. One thing you'll note about the Chinese, they have this stop here that usually keeps it from going down all the way. Smooth, but not the smoothest. Again, this one's probably not been fired though. Mag is standard, comes in and out, a little sticky. All very MAK90. And a perfectly nice, but kind of unremarkable, military-esque trigger.
Which probably goes to explain why, given any chance, I will always do an RPK video, much to many folks' boredom. But hey, why not? It came in. I figured this would be something good to do. Kind of throw it in the archive for when we need something. It's a nice gun, and I bet it'll make a good shooter. I like that it does have the original clubfoot. And I'm always just trying to give first-hand accounts of AKs, especially Chinese, because there are a lot of myths about these. As I said, and as I'm sure you know, yeah, these are banned in '89, but many places online, even today, report that they were banned in '94. The assault weapons ban for rifles came in '94. That's incorrect. They were no more or less punished by '89 than any other import AK. However, because of international events and China doing things with American ports, in April of 1994, they were sanctioned. This is why we haven't been able to get rifle-barreled guns from China. We can still get smoothbore, so shotguns, since then. Now, another myth I've read is that the assault weapons ban, which was part of the crime bill passed by Congress and signed by President Clinton, directly banned these. Again, it did not. They were already banned by the time it passed in September/October of 1994. It had nothing to do with it. Also, the assault weapons ban had nothing to do with imports. It was all pretty much focused on domestic things. Point systems no longer allowing bayonet lugs, folding stocks. Well, the thing is, the '89 import ban already applied that. In fact, the '89 ban in some ways was actually stricter. So, if the MAK90s and NHM91s had not already been sanctioned earlier, they would have still been allowed to come in after the assault weapons ban in 1994, just as the Hungarian SA-85Ms and various arsenals were allowed in. So that I would point that out. I will say, working with this bipod, folding it, unfolding it, adjusting it, is very easy. But again, it doesn't have all the safety precautions like a military bipod would, latches and all that. Oh well. Dinky mag. If you notice, there was no sling swivel on the stock, because on a military Type 56, it would be on the side of the receiver. The stock also is solid. It does have a metal butt plate, but no trap door for a cleaning kit. And again, you'd probably want to put on the Chinese proper flash hider muzzle brake if you wanted to do one of these. But 14.5 threads, you do whatever you want, left hand. And for the most part, it takes all the same parts as any other Chinese gun. Again, I don't know. I just felt like doing it. Just something we don't get all that often, because again, they have been sanctioned for coming up on 30 years now. We don't know how many were imported, and you really can't go by the serial numbers for various reasons. So, yeah. Not an RPK, not even based on a military gun as such, truly. Nevertheless cool. And a good shooter, especially if you're more of a bench shooter. So, I thought it was worth visiting. Appreciate you hanging out for a bit. If you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, check out the link to the Patreon page. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.